Good evening. I'm not even waiting for the countdown to stop. I got a lot of stuff to do tonight, so we're going to get started early. Welcome to Turfgrass Epistemology. My name is TravisShaddox. Welcome everybody in the chat. Gray, Joe, Gala, Connecticut, Monica, and Brady, Andrew, Chuck, Mike, everybody. We're going to get started. We have a lot to go over tonight. If you're new to Turfgrass Epistemology, welcome. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. If you're listening on a podcast, this channel looks at the turfgrass science and asks the question, how do we know what we know? We explore the scientific literature. Sometimes we explore truth claims. We go over videos sometimes. On Thursday night, we almost always go over scientific articles about a particular topic in turfgrass science and try to develop our critical thinking skills about certain claims and information in turfgrass science. Do we have any good reason to believe it or not? We've been going over base cation saturation, which is a fraudulent claim that nutrients should be balanced in the soil. We've been going over that for about a month or two. We're going to continue to go over it tonight with one of Furman Baer's papers. We have a video from South Dakota. We have a video from Australia. We may even go into a radio show if we have enough time. Okay. The article is relatively short. I'm going to show you exactly how misunderstandings in science, if they're allowed to get into the scientific literature, can result in millions, and might be a stretch a little bit, but potentially billions of dollars in wasted money. So here we go. Let's get started. Before I get started, next Thursday is the last Thursday night show. Thursday Night Football will start after that. So after next Thursday, I will move the Thursday night show to Tuesday night so that I can watch football. It's basically that simple. Thank you to the members. I always forget to thank the members. I always forget to ask people to like and subscribe, hit the thumbs up button. And I wanted to just reach out and thank the members. The members who the people who are members who contribute to turfgrass research, who contribute to helping keep this channel running, and any remaining revenue goes into turfgrass research that I conduct. And I want to reach out and extend a special thank you. I don't know if he's a member or not. He might be a member. To Elevated Landscapes. Cam helped me, I think, a couple weeks ago on this little system about trying to figure out how to do like short videos or whatever. I emailed him and he helped me out. And now my life is a lot easier. So you'll see a lot more videos coming out Monday through Friday, a little short clips of the content that I create. I'll end up putting little short 1 or 2 or 3 minute videos. And I've been wanting to do that for a while, but to be frank, I'm too busy. I don't really want to spend the time to do it. But there's a system that allows me to do it much more efficiently, and he helped me out with that. So thank you, Cam. Appreciate it. All right, let's get into the episode. And the article tonight is entitled "Cation Equivalent Constancy in Alfalfa." This was published by Furman Baer and Arthur Prince from New Jersey, and this was published in the Journal of American Society of Agronomy. Okay, if you remember, on Monday, if you're a member or you're listening to a podcast, the first introduction of the base cation saturation concept came from Furman Baer in 1945. He presented a paper through the Extension Office, essentially, and thank you for the compliment, A. And there was he said there's evidence that our evidence indicates it should be this. There was no evidence in that paper. And then he followed it up in the same year, 1945, from the Extension publication. He published this paper, which is a refereed paper. There are numerous things in this paper that I want to make sure everybody's clear on. One, he flat out says you don't need to use ratios at all in the refereed paper in the same year that he said you need to use ratios. And two, in this paper, there's errors in this paper. And three, there's clear evidence in this paper that I will show you. I will graph it out for you that shows in the very data set that Dr. Baer and Prince are claiming support the use of base cation saturation, the balancing of cations in the soil. In that same data set, the data is very weak for that. There's stronger evidence in the same data set to indicate that they should just simply use extractable nutrients. And I will show you that tonight. Okay, here we go. All right, let me get my pen out. Draw. Okay. Furman Baer and Arthur Prince, 1945, right after the war, basically. I think they probably submitted this during the war, actually. Evidence presented in a previous paper indicated that within certain, this is the first sentence, by the way, this is the first sentence of the paper, okay? Evidence presented in a previous paper indicated that within certain critical limits, alfalfa will thrive on soils containing widely different ratios of exchange calcium to exchange potassium. I mean, it's the first sentence in the paper. He's saying it'll tolerate a wide ratio. You don't even need to really worry about the ratios in the very first sentence. I don't know how. And then he goes on to talk about how you need to use these ratios. But later on, he'll make it even more clear that, one, you do need to use the ratios. And then later he says you don't need to use the ratio. Just very strange. And just keep in mind, this is the foundation of base cation saturation. This is how weak it is. Okay? We continue. Further, soils employed and their cation content. Further study of cation relationships in alfalfa was found possible in connection with an intensive investigation that is being made of the mineral qualities of 20 important New Jersey soils in which this plant is being used for indicator purposes, alfalfa. The soils were chosen to represent a wide difference in mineralogical, chemical, and textural composition as possible. And I'll show you table 1, but it's irrelevant. For the purpose of the study, it was deemed desirable to know, as definitely as possible, the amounts of available calcium, magnesium, and potassium in the experimental soils at the time the alfalfa seed was sown. These were calculated by adding the quantities of these elements that had been supplied in the form of lime and fertilizer in preparation for seeding the alfalfa to the amounts contained in the exchange complexes of the original soils. I don't know why they did that. I'll explain why that's bizarre, but whatever. The results of these calculations are shown in Table 2, the conjunction with the total yields of alfalfa and the cation situation in the soil at the end of experiment is there as well. So what they did was they without knowing the original nutritional content of the soil, they added in fertilizers or lime, and then they measured it. It'd be the same as one of you all going out and fertilizing your lawn or your fairway and then immediately taking a soil sample. Well, we all tell you not to do that because your numbers are going to be widely off. It's not going to be representative of what the soil might actually provide because you're providing a huge quantity already on top of that. We need to know what the soil might provide naturally, and then we would add to that whatever might be deficient. But they didn't do that, and that's fine. 1945, they were doing things, different, and so be it. But that's what they did, okay? Now, here's the chemical composition of the soil. I'm just showing this for one reason and one reason only. This shows the total constituents in percentages. The total nutritional content of soils is completely useless in any pragmatic sense to any practitioner on the planet. This is only useful to a soil chemist or a soil mineralogist or maybe a pedologist or a pedologist, something. It could be useful for some deep levels of science, but for practical use, total constituents is completely useless. And the reason I'm saying that is because there is, believe it or not, a company, and the only reason I know this is because he stood up in my presentation at a national meeting last year and said, no, we need to be doing total nutrients, and we're doing that now at my company. And I was giving the talk, and I just said I had enough. Okay, I was being polite to the gentleman because he was in the audience. He paid for the course. And he was constantly spewing a bunch of nonsense. And then he stood up and said, no, we need to do total nutrients in soils. That's where we need to start. And I said, no, total nutrients is useless to me. It's useless to you as a practitioner. Okay, there's no need to do total nutrients, and there's no correlation between what's total in the soil with what may or may not have an influence on the plant growth. Okay, we need to know what's extractable, what may become soluble over time that the plant may have access to take up. Okay, so don't fall into these. And I've never heard of a soil test company doing that until he stood up and said that. But if you're confronted with someone who's taking a soil sample and says, no, we need to do total soil analysis, just politely shut the door or hang up the phone and go find someone else, because that company does not know what the hell they're talking about. Okay, total nutrients is useless. Okay. To a practitioner, to someone like me or a scientist that can be value in it. All right. The 10 most productive soils, table 2, that was in table 1. Okay. 10 most productive soils tended to have, and this tended is a weasel word. It's a smuggling word. That's a word that people will write into language, into articles, and unfortunately it's still used today. They smuggle in significance when there is none by using the word tended to. Okay. The 10 most productive soils tended to have higher exchange capacities and higher contents of available calcium than equal numbers of soils making up the lower half of the list on the production scale. I'll show you this in a minute. Thus, the exchange capacities of these two soils average 13 and 8.4 milliequivalents. So the high yielding soils average 13, the low yielding soils averaged 8 and 8.4. And their contents of available calcium averaged 11 on the high yielding and 6.3 on the low yielding at the start of the test. By the end of the test, however, the supplies of all three cations had fallen markedly. This is not true. That's the reason I highlighted in red. It is true for almost every soil, but not for every soil and every nutrient. I'll show you that in a second. But they put this in here and it's just not true. Okay. The amount of available potassium having been reduced to such a low level in 15 of those soils as to make its lack a seriously limiting factor in plant growth. Now, let me show you the red thing that I just marked here. The red line says, by the end of the test, however, the supplies of all three cations had fallen. They have reduced, all three. So none of them were the same and none of them moved up. That's not true. As you'll see here, exchangeable cations in the soil at the end, all of them were reduced except this one right here, calcium. On this particular soil, it was 8.7 at the beginning and it was 8.8 at the end, I guess. Okay, so that the exchangeable no. I'm sorry. Let me back up. This was I apologize. I misspoke. This is not what I was trying to say here. This is an example of how the cation exchange capacity of the soil was 8.7, but the total cation of the calcium in the soil was 8.8. Okay, I apologize for what I said earlier. I misspoke and I was incorrect about what I said about all the nutrients falling. That's not true. I apologize. Okay, at the end of the test, so that didn't include the fertilizer that was applied. This 8.8 here was at the end of the test, end of the study, and did not include, this is exchangeable cations. Notice over here it says available cations, which includes the exchangeable and, for some reason they included the exchangeable and the fertilizer component. So you're going to see numbers that are greater than the CEC because these are fertilizer additives. But even at the end, there was still one cation, calcium, on this one soil that had more in the soil, more on the soil exchange sites than the soil exchange sites actually existed. There was 8.7 exchange sites and there was 8.8 calciums in the soil. So I don't know what's going on there, but it certainly leads me to believe that they not quite have the precision or the accuracy necessary to really have much confidence in these numbers. But whatever. Having said that, let's just assume it was an error. Everybody makes mistakes. I don't think I've ever published a single paper that didn't have some error in it somewhere. So it's an oversight, okay? It's a mistake, but perhaps. Okay. Then it says the amount of, this is the little sentence in here that really encouraged me to graph this out. The amount of available potassium having been reduced to such a low level, the amount, not the exchange, not the base count saturation, the amount of available potassium having been reduced to such a low level in 15 of the soils as to make its lack of a seriously limiting factor. So he's not talking about the base count saturation. He's not talking about the percentage of potassium that's on the exchange sites. He's talking about the amount. That's what I'm interested in, and that's what the evidence will indicate that we need to use is the amount or the exchangeable amount in the soil. And when he says it's reduced so low that we're actually seeing a reduction in yield, I'm like, okay, let's see where that is. Well, he doesn't really show that. You can, on this particular graph right here, you can look at the potassium over here from the exchangeable and the yield is over here. Okay. And you would just have to cross-reference this. Okay. Which is what I did. I'm going to show you that graph in a minute, but I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs. Okay. But what they're going to contain is they're going to contain the percent calcium on the exchange sites, the percent potassium or the percent magnesium relative to yield at the beginning and at the end. And we're going to show those graphs. And we're going to show how they don't really provide any evidence. There's really no strong relationship there at all. Then I'm going to graph the extractable calcium, magnesium, and potassium in this exact data set. This is the only data set in the whole graph, in the whole paper. What I'm interested in, what soil scientists are interested in, valid, reputable soil scientists who understand the science, we're interested in this right here, the exchangeable cations. We're not interested in the ratio of calcium, magnesium, or the percentage of calcium relative to the exchangeable sites. We're not interested in that. Fraudsters are interested in that. Con men are interested in that. Quacks are interested in that. Not scientists who understand soil sciences. We're interested in this over here. So I'm going to graph all of it And you will see something very interesting over here on the extractable calcium in Dr. Baer's own data set. Okay? Now let's just jump to that, because he's just going to talk about this throughout this paper. And I'm not even going to worry about all this is here, guys, is just the milk equivalents in the plant. I'm not worried about what's in the plant per se. So he's just going to go through all this, and I'm just going to instead of going through the paper, I'm just going to show it, and then I'm going to go right to the conclusions. So let's do this if I can without screwing things up. Okay. Now, all I've done is taken all those data and I've put them onto, I've correlated them. I've done a regression basically. Okay. A statistician is going to butcher me on my language there, but I'm not a statistician. I know what I said is wrong. That's all I know. Okay. Correlation between alfalfa yield and calcium saturation. This is at the beginning of the study. Okay. And you'll notice this red line is going to be on every graph. And this is where Dr. Baer and all the other people after him and all the companies today, the con artists and the quacks today will say that this is where the calcium saturation needs to be. Okay. 65% or thereabouts. And you will see that the R squared between all of these calcium saturation points and yield is 0.07. There's no relationship. And this, by the way, was the strongest model. I ran 4 or 5 different models, and this was the strongest R squared on the model. So those listening, I have alfalfa yield on the y-axis and calcium saturation on the x-axis. So there is no relationship on the correlation between alfalfa yield and calcium saturation at the beginning of the study. There's no relationship. Okay? If this bogus base count saturation was true, you would see the yield peak at this red, oh, I think I can draw on this, can't I? Yeah, I can draw on this. You would see the yield come up and peak at this point here and then decline afterwards, or thereabout, something like that. I mean, maybe the peak goes like this and then down. You never know how it would turn out, but you would see the peak. You would see the yield peak at that percentage, and you don't. And there's no relationship anyway. It's an R squared of 0.07. Okay? And this is what I'm talking about. This is an example of the fertilizer that was applied. You can't have more than 100% calcium saturation, and they do here. But this is a result of not just the extractable, but also the fertilizer that they applied, the lime that they applied. This is why they have more than 100%. Okay? This was at the beginning. Now let's look at the end. At the end, the calcium saturation correlation was 0.05. Again, the red line represents where the peak yield should be. So the yield should go like this. It should peak at the red and then go down, something like that. The strongest model I had was a linear model, and it was slightly inclined. But the R squared is 0.05, meaning that 95% of the error is not accounted for. The model only accounts for 5% we can only, I wouldn't even say 5% confident, but that's a p-value, but it's an R squared of 5, which means there's no relationship. In agricultural data, you want to see something, well, hopefully in field data around 60% or greater. 70% would be ideal, would be fantastic in field research. If you get up in the 60 range, 50, 60 range, something like that, then there's probably something going on there in terms of the relationship between these two variables. And we're at 5. Okay, nothing's going on. Okay, now let's go to magnesium saturation at the beginning. Magnesium saturation, 0.06. Alfalfa yield on the y-axis, magnesium saturation on the x-axis. This red line is at 10%, which is where the magnesium saturation is claimed to be ideal. And so this is where the yield should peak at this red line, and it doesn't. It's basically a straight line. And I ended up doing, I think this was I don't know which model this was, but this was the best fit model for this particular data set, and it was 0.06. So no relationship at the beginning. Let's look at the end with magnesium. Again, no relationship, 0.007 at the end. Okay. You have maximum yields occurring at 1 or 2 magnesium saturation all the way out to 40 magnesium saturation. 40, 30, 25, 20, 15 magnesium saturation, you still have essentially the same yield as you have down at 5 and below. Okay, at the end of the study. So this wouldn't have as much fertilizer input on this particular graph. Now let's look at potassium saturation. Potassium saturation is 0.43, not bad, but it's declining. In other words, the maximum yield at the beginning occurred somewhere between, say, 3% potassium and 7, something like that. And they're saying the maximum should be 5. So it's like, okay, well, it's not too bad. You know, it's declining as you get taller. I'm like, okay, it's not too bad. Then at the end, 0.44, but look what happens at the end. All the potassium, because the yield, obviously they've harvested the alfalfa and the potassium in the soil declined. Everything's down below 2%. And we have maximum yield occurring down at 1% potassium saturation. The red bar represents where it should be. And we got maximum yield occurring down at 1% at the end. And at the beginning, remember, it was at 5%. Remember, so we're at 60 grams with alfalfa yield here. Let's just say 60. And we're here 60, even at 1% potassium at the end of the study. Okay? Now it looks like the calcium-magnesium ratio. We're going to watch a video from Australia on calcium-magnesium at the end here. Calcium-magnesium ratios are complete nonsense in Turfgrass. We've shown at least two articles on that. We've shown a bunch of articles in Ag, and they just cannot let this go. I think it's their ego or their recognition that if they acknowledge that they were wrong, they would, feel silly or dumb or whatever. I don't know but they just will not let the calcium magnesium thing go. I'm talking about the con artists. They're stuck on calcium magnesium. Watch the video today that was just released a week or two ago. I'll die on calcium magnesium. Calcium magnesium is really, really important. It's not important. Show me some data that shows it's important. Because right here's some data from the very person who invented the base count saturation in the paper that he's claiming you should do. You should follow it. And there's no relationship. It's 0.007. Maximum yields occurred at a calcium-magnesium ratio of around 2, all the way out to around 15. And they're saying it should be 6.5. There's no relationship here between calcium-magnesium ratio and alfalfa yield, even though in the very same paper, he's claiming that you should have about 6.5. Okay, that's at the beginning. At the end, it's 0.04. Here's where the maximum yield should occur, this red line. And you see maximum yield occurring, say, 2 or 3, all the way out to 35 calcium magnesium ratios. 35 to 1 calcium magnesium, you still see a maximum yield at that far. Maximum yields occurring at 10, turning at 15. I mean, maximum yields occurring all over the place. And calcium magnesium ratio doesn't seem to have any influence on it at all. In fact, the R squared is 0.04. Okay? But instead of looking at base saturation, let's look at the extractable amount. Now remember, okay, that in his, let's see if I can get to it, in his paper here, he showed not only the CEC here and the available cations at the beginning, but also available cations at the end, and he showed the extractable or the exchangeable cations here. Back then they used milliequivalents as the extractable unit. And here we have milliequivalents. These are just the milliequivalents. These aren't compared to the cation exchange capacity. These are in milliequivalents, okay? So in the very same day, we just showed that when you compare the ratio of calcium magnesium, there's nothing there. When you look at the calcium saturation relative to the CEC, there's nothing there. Magnesium CEC, there's nothing there. Potassium on the CEC, there's nothing there. There's no relationship between these variables in maximum yield of alfalfa. But in the statement above here, he said this. He said, the amount of available potassium having been reduced to such a low level in 15 of the soils as to make its lack a serious limiting factor. So what he should have done is what I'm going to show you right now is just do this. Just graph this set here. So let's do that and see what happens. So here's, instead of looking at base saturation, let's look at the extractable quantity. And when we do that, we have magnesium and milliequivalents and yield on the y-axis and magnesium milliequivalents on the x-axis. The R squared is now 0.36, up from like 0.05 or something. Still not great, but you can see there's a relationship here. This is an exponential plateau curve. And you can see that the yield tends to plateau once we hit about, in this particular case, 1 or 2 milliequivalents of magnesium. But then when you drop below this, you see the yield drop off exponentially, drop off very sharply. And you will see this in paper after paper of correlation data on turfgrass. And in Dr. Baer's own paper, he has the data sitting there waiting to be graphed and waiting to be used. But instead, somehow he got diluted and started looking at the base count of saturation rather than the quantity extracted. Okay, now let's look at potassium in milliequivalents. And you see a very similar graph. Now we're up to R squared of 0.4 from Dr. Baer's own data. You see the yield decline drastically once you get down to below 0.1 potassium in milliequivalents. And as the potassium goes up on in extractable potassium, you see the yield go up until it reaches a maximum at about 0.2 milliequivalents of potassium. This is the type of data set that we use. This is how we determine correlation. This is a correlation graph that you would use to determine critical limits in the soil in soil testing. When I show you the phosphorus data in the next week or two, whenever I get to it, you're going to see a very similar graph to this with Mehlich 1 and Mehlich 3 extractable phosphorus on turf grasses. It's a very similar setup. 1945, they were sitting right on it and I don't think they realized it. Now let's go to calcium. Now we're up to 0.68 R squared. And you see as the potassium declines from 15 down to 10, down to 5, and down to 0, you see a very predictable decline in yield. So yes, these nutrients are having effect. Yes, the potassium, as he mentioned, as it declines, you see a decline such that it's now becoming deficient as the extractable comes down. Yes, you're seeing that. You're seeing that in calcium too. The yield is dropping drastically as the extractable calcium drops. It has to do with the extractable quantity, not the ratio of one to the other, or not the amount that's on the exchange site relative to another one. And it's in the very same paper published by the author who created it. I don't know how we get into this clown world. It's like the Twilight Zone or something. I mean, it's sitting there staring at us, and somehow it's like I don't know how it gets convoluted and I don't know how it gets twisted around. But I mean, you don't have to go very far to find refuting evidence to base cation saturation. It's in the same paper, the very first paper that was published on it, and you don't have to go very far to find evidence to support the extractable amount. It's in the same paper too. You just got to read it. It's just sad. Can you imagine how many millions and millions of dollars have been wasted on this nonsense, throwing out stuff? And hopefully I'm speeding up because I'm trying to get to the end, because there's a piece at the end on one of these videos that is golden. And it really sums up the whole base cation saturation thing nicely. Okay. Let's go to the conclusions of this paper. Short paper, I've told you. I think this is the conclusions. The sum, hang on. Where am I at? Yeah, summary and conclusions. The sum of the equivalents of calcium, magnesium, potassium per unit of plant material tended to be a constant for the produce of, that has to do with plant tissue. Forget that. Now, here's the sentence here. Now, this was actually quoted in a review paper on base cation saturation by, I can't remember I've already gone over the review paper. I can't remember who it was. And this was the paper that they were talking about. Now, remember, this author, Dr. Baer, in the same year had just published in the Extension Bulletin the ratios. 65% calcium, 10% magnesium, 5% potassium. He just did this the same year. And in the same year, in a refereed paper, he says the following: once the supply of each cation is adequate to meet the specific need for it, there can be a wide range in ratios in the remaining quantities that are absorbed by the plant to meet its total cation need. So in other words, as long as there's enough in the soil solution or extractable quantity, the ratios are irrelevant. Don't worry about the ratios as long as there's enough in the soil, by the very person who created base cation saturation. So fraudsters, con men, quacks, he's your Messiah. I mean, this is the guy who started it, and he's sitting here saying in the same paper, it's not that important. As long as you got enough in the soil, ratios are irrelevant. Don't worry about it. So how do you argue that? He's the one who said it. It would appear that the soil on which it is to be grown should be fortified with an abundance of calcium and magnesium in preparation for seeding, but that the potassium application should be governed by the specific annual needs of the plant. A suitable application being made at the seeding time and additional quantities being supplied each year if the crop is allowed to continue on the same land. The annual applications of potassium must be sufficient to maintain the potassium content of the plant at not less than 1%, but it should not be so large as to affect a substitution of potassium for calcium and magnesium in the functions that are common to all three. So basically saying if you should apply enough potassium, but not too much to change, to compete so much with calcium and magnesium that it would somehow have a deleterious effect on the plant. So in other words, apply enough, but not too much. Don't worry about the ratios. I don't know how on earth it even got to this point. You have to understand the magnitude of this, and I'm going to show you a video at the end. It is enormous. This is not some small thing. We're in turf. We're just a little drop in the bucket compared to ag. But these guys have ag tightened down tight around this concept. There is so many farmers who are fleeced and taken advantage of and conned into applying all these nutrients when they don't need them, and they're it's unfortunate. It's Joseph Smith in the seer stones, basically is what it is. These guys have a really good sales pitch, and they can talk really. They're confident. They're confident. That's what con men do. They're confidence men. They're real good with talking, and they're really convincing. And they get you thinking about it, and they, oh, that sounds good, and you spend money on it. Don't have any delusions. They know exactly what they're doing. Okay. Now let's go to the internet here. I have a couple of videos. One of them is only 1 minute. One's only 3 minutes. And we'll see. And then they have a little radio show at the end, like a 2-minute clip on a radio show. It's genius. All right. So now the video we're going to watch tonight is, okay. It's called Calcium to Magnesium Ratios. Jesus Christ. 60-second lectures by a YouTube channel called Symbiosis Agriculture, and I believe they're in Australia. Let's listen and see if they've got some sort of evidence that has somehow eluded me.
Hello and welcome along to 60-second lectures brought to you by Symbiosis Agriculture and Natural Performance Limited. The topic of this lecture is calcium to magnesium ratios. Calcium and magnesium are both cations, however they both behave very differently. Calcium is the flocculation agent of the soil. It opens up and starts to incorporate your soil particles into clays. This is important.
Yeah. Well, let me just stop there. I'm not on medications, but I may have to get on some if I keep doing this because it's just nuts. Calcium doesn't form soil particles into clays. It's ridiculous. Clays are clays. There's sand, there's silt, there's clays. Clays are formed by a geological process, not from calcium. What he's talking about is actually, I think what he means to say is calcium will help, bind's not the right word, but it'll help flocculate the soil, the clay particles into PEDs, into a structure, a soil structure. They don't form clays. Good God.
For tight, heavy clay soils. And magnesium is important for holding together and binding your soils. This is particularly important in loose, sandy soil. Too much magnesium, we get rock-hard, concrete-like soil structure that becomes sticky in the wet and cracks when it becomes dry.
Yeah, so I hear this a lot. Man, you should use high magnesium in sand soils to keep it tighter. You should use calcium in clay soils to keep it looser. Well, okay, show me the evidence. It's not being, contrary. This is you're just saturated with so much misinformation and nonsense. You have to find some way to prioritize it, because some of it inevitably will be true. But, oh, calcium does this, and too much magnesium, you're going to have concrete, cement, or whatever he said. It's all just, whether it's coming out of their mouth or coming out of their rear end, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. There's no reason to believe it. It's all a bunch of nonsense. And unfortunately, well, in this world, I happen to be interested in passionate about this particular world and soil fertility and turfgrass science. So I happen to, read a lot about it. But most people don't. I mean, most people are neurotypical, and I'm not. I mean, most people have they go out and do things. I mean, I've told my wife, I'm trying to build a compound so I never have to leave my house. Okay. I'm this close. Okay. I'm literally like a year away. I think I can just never leave my house. That's not normal. Okay. So my point is that I'm knowledgeable on this. So it just right off my back. It doesn't bother me at all, but I'm not knowledgeable on other things at all. Like, I don't know, like, changing a radiator or whatever in the car. I don't know how to do any of that stuff. So when I hear information, I still have to use the same critical thinking skills. I don't assume it's true. I don't assume it's false. I just hear it, and then I go try to look it up by someone who's a specialist in that area before I go and spend $40,000 buying a piece of equipment that's useless. So I guess what I'm saying is this is relatively easy for me to pull out, and it's like shooting fish in a barrel. But I still use the same critical thinking skills on areas that I don't know anything about. And so the same thing goes for the people who are watching this video or listening. You might not know the calcium magnesium, but you don't need to know. What you do need to understand is that the information is just information. There's no evidence that he's providing that indicates that what he's saying is true, and therefore there's no reason to believe it. And you don't necessarily have to be responsible for going and looking it up. I mean, I can't be responsible for going and looking up every possible truth claim in the turfgrass industry. It's up to them, the one making the claim, to support it with evidence. So if they're not going to support it with any evidence, then I'm just going to go about my day and move on. It's not going to convince me one way or the other. That's one of the foundational pillars of turf epistemology. Okay.
So our ratio depends on the cation exchange capacity of your soil. With a low cation exchange capacity, you will need a little bit more magnesium. Those are your sandy type soils. With high cation exchange capacity, you're going to need a bit more calcium. They are your clay soils. And typically speaking, we want to see our calcium to magnesium ratios around 7-1. That's around 68% calcium and around 10% magnesium.
Yeah, and we just showed you a paper from the very person that started it. We showed you two different graphs of calcium, magnesium, and alfalfa yield. Not a damn thing happened. All the way from 2 all the way out to 15 or 16 in turfgrass soils. They've gone from 1 all the way out to 100-1 and still had perfectly acceptable turfgrass and all the ratios in between. Okay? This has been done on turfgrass, and I go back and look at the playlist. You can see the episodes that I've gone over where I've shown that before in the literature. They've looked at that, and as of yet, there's not any evidence to support any interest or any management practice that involves trying to balance out the calcium, magnesium in turfgrass systems.
With this ratio in balance, our soils are more likely to have the structure required to house the biology to provide the ecosystem services to save you paying for them. This has been another 60 seconds.
Yeah, you're not saving me paying for anything. You're encouraging me to pay for extra calcium if my magnesium is too high, or extra magnesium if my potassium is too high, or extra potassium if my calcium is too high. That's ridiculous. And the Olson 82 paper clearly shows that you're spending a lot more money following these methods than if you followed the SLAN method or the sufficiency level approach. Okay, there's papers that have looked at the quantity of resources used and the cost it took to achieve the same yield following base count saturation or build up and maintain or SLAN. And it's time after time after time. It's the SLAN method, or, I mean, it doesn't have to be the SLAN values because the values are going to change, but the concept of there's a critical limit in the soil. As long as you're above that critical limit, adding more isn't likely going to help. That concept is what I'm referring to, what I mean when I say SLAN. Okay, sufficiency level of available nutrients is what that stands for. Okay, the next video. comes from our old friends, Brian and Darren Hefty from the Ag PhD show. These guys are huge. They have a radio show. I think that might even be on Sirius XM. They run a massive con fair in South Dakota that really brings in a lot of people and indoctrinates them into the delusion of base kind of saturation and calcium magnesium ratios and all this nonsense. And they have about a 3-minute video here. And at the end, I'm going to show a little audio clip from a radio show. Let's see what Darren and Brian have to say today about calcium.
One of the most important things you need to look at in your soil is calcium. What is your calcium level in terms of both parts per million and percent base saturation? We're going to talk about the importance of calcium today.
Okay, let me just start with there before I can get going. If it's not clear by now, let me make it painfully obvious to everybody listening or watching. When I look at a soil test, it's only after several criteria have been checked off before I even get to that point. But calcium is the last thing I'm looking at on a soil test. It is exceedingly rare to ever see a beneficial response in the turfgrass from the application of calcium. Having said that, to my Calendly, members and people that have been joining me there's one or two that have shown me soil tests in turf grasses that are obviously calcium deficient. It can happen, okay? But it is so ridiculously rare. Calcium is almost always the dominant cation in virtually every soil of agronomic importance anyway. And so don't get overly concerned about having some sort of balance of calcium and applying more calcium. Lime is different. Gypsum is different for different needs. But applying calcium for the sake of calcium, like applying calcium nitrate, for example, because you think you're going to get a benefit from the calcium is futile. It's wishful thinking is what it is.
Calcium is really important for the structure of your soil. You need enough calcium out there to have good pore space, to have good microbial life, good air movement, and also good water infiltration.
Yeah, all that's true. But I'm not interested necessarily about that. I'm interested in the application of the calcium. What I'm applying, is that necessary? Calcium is important for all. Like he said, calcium is important. That's no question. What I want to know is what am I going to gain in return for me buying calcium and applying it to my soil? How am I going to gain anything back? I spent, say, whatever it is, $60 an acre, $100 an acre on this. How am I going to get a return on that investment? Talking to me about calcium and the value of calcium is a red herring. I understand that, but that's in the soil already. Don't distract me. Okay, don't get distracted by that. Focus on what am I going to get out of what I'm applying. That's the important thing.
Through your soil. Calcium is really important for nutrient uptake as well. In fact, it's been said that most nutrients come in on the back of calcium into your plants. You need calcium to be able to open that plant up and allow those nutrients to get in. So it's one of those really critical nutrients. However, for most farmers, they're looking at N, P, and K. How much nitrogen do I need? How much phosphorus do I have to apply? How much potassium do I need out in my soil? And they're kind of forgetting that the first thing they should be looking at is how much calcium I've got.
No, don't do that. The first thing you should look at is how much calcium do I got. That's what I'm saying. These guys are slick, man. They know how to spin a yarn. Believe me. They've been fully indoctrinated. They've been doing this for decades. And the amount of people that go to their open days, their field days, and they have tents and bands and games for the kids. It's actually kind of fun. I've never been there, but I've seen videos of it. It looks like a lot of fun. But they use that as an opportunity to indoctrinate their members, their crowd, their clientele. That, I'm not you're not going to gain that much in most situations. It's nitrogen that's almost always deficient. If you're going to look at nutrient application, that's where you should spend most of your money, not on calcium. Give me a break.
One of the things Darren didn't mention with calcium is soil pH. If you have a low soil pH, the fix to that is quite simple. It's lime. It's calcium carbonate. Now, you want to be careful about this because if you put on too much calcium carbonate, you can actually raise the pH beyond where you want it to get to. And also, you've got to look at what crops are you raising. So, for example, if you're raising blueberries, well, blueberries like a 5.5 pH. Corn likes about a 6.2, 6.3, 6.4. Okay, if you're raising alfalfa, that prefers somewhere around a 7 pH. So you might want to vary this depending on your crop and your cropping rotation.
Yeah, well, all that is I'm in line with that. In other words, there are different pHs that these different plants will grow better at than others. So, for example, let's say centipede grass would be an easy one to go to. Centipede grass is going to tend to grow a little bit better in more acidic soils than you get up in the high 7s, whereas Bermuda grass can grow all over creation. But that's not necessarily a result or that's not directly correlated to the calcium. And there's a lot more going on in there. The plants have different abilities to extract nutrients at those different pHs or tolerate certain toxicities at different pHs, particularly in low pHs. So it's the soil-plant interaction and dynamic that seems to be forgotten. I don't know. So I agree with him that whatever pH the plant is growing best at, let's say the example of centipede grass that Dr. Kurtel had, the pH of 4 versus 5 versus 6 or whatever, when you saw the centipede grass growing very poorly at 4, but very good at 5 and 6 and 7 or whatever. Those are good examples of why you should adjust pH, but it doesn't necessarily have to do with calcium or calcium deficiencies. Okay? That's what they're implying.
But again, calcium is tremendously important when it comes to pH.
One of the things that you want to look for.
Well, I don't know how to answer that or how to respond to that other than calcium doesn't influence pH. It's the one in lime. The calcium in lime does not influence pH. The calcium in lime knocks off the hydrogen and aluminum on the exchange sites, and those acidifying compounds will be neutralized from the carbonate, calcium carbonate. So the calcium in the lime has essentially nothing to do with neutralizing the acidity. It exchanges the acidifying elements on the soil and moves them into solution so that they can be neutralized by the carbonate. So, I don't know if that's where he was going with that or not, but I wouldn't say that applying calcium is going to have an influence on pH. There's in the soil itself, it may, if it's just sitting there, there's a relationship between higher pHs and higher solubility of calcium up to a point, but anyway, we go.
On your soil test is your base saturation test. And if you don't,
one
of the things that you want to look for on your soil test is your base saturation test.
Yeah, the only reason I would look for anything on the base saturation area would be if they have sodium on there and you have some sort of interest in determining whether or not you have a sodic soil. The exchangeable sodium percentage or the sodium absorption ratio can be used to categorize your soil as sodic or not. It can kind of give you an idea of your risk where you lie in that if you're in those areas, like say Utah and, I guess up into, the north central mountain areas where we have some more sodic soils. But other than that, it's useless. Don't worry about it other than that. And don't even worry about that unless you have a sodic situation. Okay? So here comes the BS flowing here.
And if you don't have a base saturation on the soil test that you've been sending in, we'd strongly encourage you get a complete analysis done.
I would encourage you to not do that. And all the evidence in the scientific literature, and I mean, it's hard for me to say this with a whole lot of confidence, but I do mean all the evidence. Show me any evidence anywhere in any of the refereed literature that is even remotely convincing that we should follow base cation saturation rather than a slant approach. Anything. I just showed you the paper of the man who started it. Even in his own paper, it shows that the extractable amount should be used rather than the saturation of calcium or magnesium or potassium. In the very same paper. So show me anything. I'm all ears. I have to hear it. So don't follow any of this stuff. There's no reason to.
Have micronutrients and base saturation and more to look at. With base saturation, there are 5 nutrients that we're looking at: calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, and hydrogen.
Yeah, so the sodium is the one, like I said earlier, the sodium is the one thing that if you happen to be in a situation where you might, let's say you have high sodic waters or high sodic soils and parent material or something, whatever the case is, and you happen to be in a sodic area and you're worried about that, that is one thing that I would, that is valid. Okay, so be aware of that. But other than that, nothing. And that has nothing to do with base cation saturation. It has to do with just sodium absorption, the sodic soils.
And when we look at calcium, this one should occupy 65 to 75% of that base saturation test.
And we just showed you from the very same paper, it can go from 25 to 90 or 100, whatever it was. And the yield was the same. There was no relationship. I really believe, or at least I'm beginning to be convinced, that I just don't think, I don't know if they even know how to read a scientific paper. I don't even know if they even know they exist. I mean, like, for example, if I was in this world and I was in his shoes, and let's say they hired someone like myself and they go, well, we want you to start selling it. I would want to go look up the information to gain more confidence and knowledge on this topic. The first place I'm going to go is to the scientific literature, start looking it up so I learn more about it. You're not going to find a single paper. I mean, show me one. Not a single one, but they just say this stuff with such confidence. And then the next thing out of their mouth, well, we've been doing it for 30 or 40 years and it's been working. You've been doing it for 30, 40 years and you've been fleecing the industry. It's a racket is what it is.
If you fall somewhere in that range, your pH is generally going to fall in line or at least relatively close.
Yeah, and that's the puddle in the pothole analogy. Well, if you do this, it's going to look like that. No, you look like that because that's the shape of the pothole that you fell into. It's just coincidental. It doesn't. It's just crazy.
And you're going to have enough soil porosity to be successful with what you're doing with crop production. If you're below 60% calcium, in many cases, what we would ask is that you put some lime out there to try to raise that calcium up. Those 5 nutrients in base saturation add up to 100%. And if we're low in the calcium, we must be high in something else.
So there you go. If I'm low on this, I'm high on something else. So I got to start balancing it out. And I just showed you yield from the man who started it of calcium saturations that were well below 65%. And the yield was just as high as it was at 65 or 80 or 90. And you'll find another 4 or 5 or 10 papers that show the same thing in ag crops and in turf grass.
Now, when Darren talks about 65 to 75%, let's say you have 90 or 95% calcium.
And now nothing's going to happen. You're going to have the highest, you're going to still have this high yield. You're still going to have perfectly good looking turf. But let's see how this, because if I say that, or if he recognizes and that is the case, then he can't sell anything. There's nothing that you need to buy from him. If the yield's going to be the same, whether you do something or whether you don't do something, well, then don't do something. Don't buy any more calcium, or don't buy any potassium or magnesium. It's going to be the same. But if that's his position, he doesn't make any money. So there must be something that he can sell them or convince them that they have to buy from him to lower that potassium level down. When in reality, it's probably not going to have any benefit to the plant at all.
Look, we're not telling you that in one shot, in one application of a bunch of other stuff, you can drop that calcium down to 75% and make it pay. Now, I'm not saying that wouldn't necessarily be a good thing for you to get the calcium down a little bit, but it's going to cost some money. You'd have to add some other products to it, and it really could take some time. So the big thing to focus on here is, let's take a look at soil pH, let's take a look at parts per million of calcium, and ideally, yes, if we're in that...
Okay, before he goes, he just said that if it's up to 90, you probably could, but it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of money. So he's basically saying don't do that. But bear with me. Okay, so if it's at 90, well, you could. I'm not telling you it would be a bad thing, but you'd have to put a bunch of other stuff on there. It can be expensive. So just hold that thought until the end of the video, and I'll turn on the radio program and you'll see something else.
At 65 to 75% range of calcium, that's great. If not, we should probably strive toward that range as a long-term goal on our farm, and usually we're going to have healthier soil.
So to sum things up with calcium, it's important to look at the parts per million. It's also important to look at the base saturation percentage.
No, it's not.
So you can start to determine what's going on, what am I high in, what am I low in, and do I need to add more calcium to help my crop?
Yeah, I've just never seen so much just misinformation. And I with them, they're so far down the rabbit hole, it probably is misinformation, meaning I don't think they actually know what's true. If they did, then it would be disinformation that they're spreading. But I just don't think they know. I don't think they want to know the truth. They even care what the truth is. Okay, so I was watching this video, And I was like, oh, Lord, here we go. That might be a good one. And I scrolled down here and I saw a little comment down here. And it says, 10 years ago, I put a ton of gypsum on a lawn, another attempt to break up the clay. I get that a lot too. I need to apply gypsum to break up my clay. A couple of years later, I realized that was the wrong answer. A soil test was performed late summer 2021, and base saturation of calcium is over 90%. I don't know if you can see that, guys and gals. It's over 90% at some 5,300 parts per million. How do I open that up further? The advice on the guy produced the soil sample results said that it's coming at the price of potassium primarily. So that's what he said. Basically, the calcium's so high, 90%, and it's coming at a cost of potassium. In other words, he's losing potassium. Okay, that's the Furman Bear thing, really. He was wanting to apply lime as a means to reduce luxury consumption of potassium because at the time lime was less expensive than potassium. That was the whole concept behind it. That's what all started this whole nonsense. But then I saw a reply. This was on a lawn. I clicked on this button. It said, reply, Brian and Darren addressed your comments on Ag PhD's radio show. I'm like, oh, good. Let's listen to that. So I'm going to click on this. And remember, he just said if it's a 90% or more, I'm not going to say it'd be bad to bring it down, but it's going to be expensive. Just, probably wouldn't bother. Now let's see what he says when it's when this guy is replying back to his video.
And from Michael, he said, about 10 years ago, I put a ton of gypsum on a lawn, trying to break up the clay a little bit and soften things up. However, a couple years ago, I realized this was the wrong answer. The soil test said my base saturation calcium is now over 90% in this area, and it's hurting my potassium uptake. What would you do in this particular situation?
So you can see it's the exact same question. They just repeated it. So now let's listen to what he says.
Okay, so could you flush the excess calcium out of the soil? It's hard. Honestly, and I hate to even say this, but excess nitrogen can strip calcium out. But you really don't want to do that because environmentally that's not great. So what would I do?
Okay, so he said don't do this. But one of what his mind went first to was just apply a bunch of nitrogen out there because you have too much calcium. Okay, and then he's like, oh, well, it's probably not a good idea because it's environmentally a concern. Okay, well, at least he caught himself.
I'd raise everything else. I just figured, all right, my calcium...
Wait, hang on.
Seems kind of set. I'm not going to try to flush it out with excess nitrogen and be environmentally irresponsible. Instead, I'm just going to add more magnesium if I need to. I'll add some more potassium. I'll add more of whatever I have to get everything else in balance and work around that.
And that's the racket. I applied calcium probably when you didn't need to, and my calcium's too high. Oh, well, what you can do is just apply some potassium, apply some magnesium, lower the calcium down, and I'll work around that. And just keep going back and forth and back and forth. And that is a racket. They're selling you a solution to a problem that does not exist, deficient calcium. Then, when the calcium is too high, that's a problem too. We have the solution to that. Apply more potassium until the calcium comes down a little bit further. The magnesium's a little low too because the calcium's up because we can only have 100%, remember? So you need to apply some more magnesium too. So when the calcium went up, even though the quantity in the soil might be the same for calcium magnesium, the percentage on the exchange site has to go down because it's 100%. So you got to apply more more potassium, more magnesium. That is a racket, is what it is. They're creating a problem that does not exist and then selling you the solution to the problem that they created. Okay? I thought that was awful nice of them to put that on a radio program. Literally right after he said if it's 90%, it's going to be expensive to add a bunch of stuff, so probably don't worry about it. Then the very next thing out of his mouth is, if it's 90%, I'd go buy some potassium, put on some magnesium, potassium, lower that calcium down. So which one is it? When you fraudsters and quacks and con artists, once you guys talk to each other and figure out your own BS and at least get some consistency in your nonsense and then come have a conversation with me. Because you can't even agree on your own BS, your own nonsense. You can't line it up. So when you do, give me a call. Okay. Until then, I'm not following any management practice based upon base cation saturation or any calcium magnesium ratios or any of that nonsense. And the reason is there's no evidence to support it and there's ample evidence to refute it. All right, guys and gals, let me look at the questions if there's any questions in the chat. A says, enjoy the short excerpts, very effective and entertaining. Okay, thanks. I appreciate that because I just started kind of getting into that world, A. I guess I'll call you A. That's your name on thing here. And I figured out a system that I can kind of do it with not a whole lot of input on my end because I just don't have a lot of time to go through that. So you can thank Elevated Landscapes for helping me with that. Jason Moss says, keep up the good work. Thank you. Jeremy Shield says, prophetic that the video included sheep. It did. You're right. Yeah. I didn't even think about that, Jeremy. That's a good line. I like that. They've been doing this for decades. A says again. Yeah. Chuck Benzing says, calcium drives the bus. You know, if you search hard enough, I haven't. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I haven't searched this hard. But if you search hard enough, you might find some bona fide turf response to calcium somewhere in the literature, maybe. But I've never seen it. And I mean, unless you're intentionally creating a calcium deficiency on purpose, I mean, I don't think you'd ever see that. So yeah, calcium dilemmas. And Chuck, it's been like on Pathless Road now. That's a call out to a musician, I think. And Gray Fox says, very lightning. Thanks. I really appreciate there's a handful of you guys in here that are here all the time. I really appreciate that. Some of you kind of reach out and drop me a little line here or there. I don't always have time to respond to you guys. I really try my best to respond to the members when they email me or shoot me a text to the phone number that's in the description of the video. I try my best, especially if it's a member, but I can't always do that. But don't lose confidence in me. It's just a matter of getting all my priorities lined up for that day. And then when I finally sit down to respond to things, sometimes it's, too late. So, but I really appreciate everybody's input into the channel and kind of asking me, what about this? Have you seen this video? I do enjoy that. I do watch those. So thank you very much. Connecticut, Cumonica. I will be in Connecticut on March. It looks like March 4th, 5th, March 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th. There's the New England, I think it's called the New England Turf Research Foundation. I haven't signed anything with them yet, but literally today I'm going back and forth trying to work out the details of the talks and the travel and all that stuff. So I'll be up there at that point. So if you're in that area, I'm assuming you're up there, then Connecticut, Cumonican, if you're up in that area, maybe we can grab dinner or something, or anybody else that's in that area, come by and say hello. I'll be giving a talk on soil sampling, simplifying soil tests, and a 4-hour lecture on let's look at your soil tests. I think it's a 4-hour lecture on that as well. So if you haven't got enough from the channel, you can show up and watch it live, contribute live. I'd love to meet any of you all who are listeners of the channel. Thanks a lot, guys and gals. I'll be back on Monday morning for the members only show at 10 a.m. See you then. Good evening. Bye.